welcome to the latest episode of the Pop Occulture Show with Lilith Dorsey and Jason Winslade. She's Lilith, I'm Jason. This week was Lilith's pick for what we watched and we'll be talking about today. Why don't you tell us about what that is?
I wanted to do this film because I think it got a lot of critical acclaim when it first came out, and I think it's a real Louisiana story, and it's Beasts of the Southern Wild, which has quickly become, one of my classic favorites since it came out a little over a decade ago. And I think it both, for me, speaks as a Louisiana story, as a swamp story, and also a coming of age story, which is one of my favorite genres to sort of play with. I think for those of us who are Gen X, we're kind of constantly coming of age over and over again because we were feral kids. So we seem sort of stuck in that wild, preteen, youth kind of stage. And it really was just so beautiful and so poignant and so powerful for me. So this is why I chose this. What'd you think?
We are right now, we're recording this in the middle of Mardi Gras. I got a few things going on behind me. You're up late parading, and this seemed to be it's certainly not a typical New Orleans type of movie, but I found it interesting that in the midst of extreme poverty, we still have some of the Mardi Gras beads in the background on the set, so it very much is about that, still sort of adjacent to that world. What did I think of the movie? It's funny because at the time I was aware of it because Oscars used to be my Super Bowl, and so I would keep up with all the films that were getting accolades that year, and I do remember all the talk about this. And I never did see it at the time, but it's a beautiful film from just my viewing of it. But also, just it is very. I don't want to say it's disturbing, but we were talking earlier about how it is obviously so far outside my experience to just sort of witnessing this kind of survival based lifestyle and extreme poverty, and of course in a part of the country that, while I'm know it somewhat from visiting, is very different from my Midwest lifestyle and upbringing, and even growing up around some very lower economic status folks in Northeast Ohio. It's still nothing like that. So it almost felt a post-apocalyptic in a way, and there's a lot to that, I think. And it was filmed it came out in 2012, so it was filmed only like a few years after Katrina. And I don't know that the storm in that film is supposed to be Katrina, but I don't think it matters. I think it's just sort of like, this is what happens, right? So it's kind of like a magical realism. Like, I saw bits and pieces of what we talked about in like Water for Chocolate. Certainly some stuff in Eve's bio, although even Eve's bio was definitely a different class of people who are the main characters. But it is sort of, in a way, a quest film, and there are mythological analogs that are happening that are they're kind of subtle in a way. And it also made me think of Where the Wild Things Are too, even though it's nothing
Yes.
like that film, but there's still that notion of the child being surrounded by the larger than life scary beasts. So it's a and what it is to sort of have a relationship with those creatures, even if it's from a distance, until the end. So there's a lot of different things going on here, because first I was thinking to myself, how is this a cult? And then I started to see kind of some of the there's a lot of different elements I'm sure we'll talk about, but it's not a cult in the more overt sense, like when we talk about Rosemary's Baby or witchcraft or voodoo films. They didn't include any of that. There were no voodoo stereotypes in this film.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I think we got the scene where she, with the storm is coming and she fixes this jar of roots and herbs for her hush puppy to give to her dad. So I think there's definitely a hoodoo spell going on there. I think, again, the same way that we've got it in Eve's Bayou, where she's sort of trying to fix her dad, literally, like, and also magically fix her dad. So
Well,
that was a parallel I thought was big.
yeah, I mean, I felt like he's maybe hoodoo, but definitely sort of natural healing herb work, but nothing sort of overtly like magical. Although there's a thing later on about the gator is magic, and there's definitely symbolism going on.
That's why I think it's a Louisiana story, because I think the magic is that of a child, and I think the magic is in the way that Hush Puppy understands the world. For me, I see your point about extreme poverty, but I also see it as a Louisiana story. When I was at NYU, we did a Southern cinema class, and it was before this movie, but this movie would have been perfect. And my professor was from the South, but not here in Louisiana. And every time I would bring up Louisiana, he's like, it's a third world country. And not in a insulting kind of way, just this is a literal cinematic realness. This is what we have. There's a segment in the movie where the levee breaks and that floods their land. And I think that while the movie's not about Katrina, it's about all this engineering and remediation that the state and the government have tried to do in order to alleviate some of the flooding. And it doesn't work, and it destroys people, and they don't think about the environment, and they don't think about the impact on the local people. And it's so, nobody's going to argue with me, but it's so corrupt, and there's so much, money going to the wrong place. And it's really sad. And I think that it is an apocalyptic story in that way, but the apocalypse for people in Louisiana has been happening for a long time. She says the end of the world already happened. I think for a lot of people, that's really true. We've got a spot here in my neighborhood that we call the end of the world, and it's where the canal meets the river. So we've got this kind of man-made canal that's, whatever, and it's joining the Mississippi. And that's kind of this spiritual thing where, all these waters are meeting and mingling, the man-made and the natural, the mighty Mississippi, right? And for us, it's like a party spot, but it's also like a wasteland. There's a lot of, I want to say, like pit bulls and junkies that spend their time there, unfortunately. And there's an old giant abandoned factory with graffiti and people living there, and it's creepy. It's just like, this is the apocalypse that's our reality and has been our reality for a really long time here in Louisiana.
Yeah, the film's it's very much about that kind of contrast where it's funny because we're talking about Mardi Gras and everything, and at the beginning of the film, there's a very clear statement by Hush Puppy that we have more holidays than anyone else, and that there's always something they're celebrating, and it shows them with like makeshift fireworks, and their parade is a sort of a junkyard parade, and there's just constantly celebrating and sort of noting that this community is very integrated, and there's not even a thought given to any kind of racial disparity or difference. It's all they're all together in the bathtub, and that's what they call this fictional but based on real communities. They call it the bathtub, and so there is no division like that. They're all of the same family, black and white. So it's definitely something where in the midst of the survival that has to happen, there's always celebration and of course massive alcoholism.
Well,
So around it.
you
Sure. I mean,
got to do what you got to do.
I mean, it's yeah, part of the lifestyle. And he's he's giving his 9-year-old daughter drinks. So just we should probably talk about the film as so was it based I want to say it was based on a play, maybe something
Yes, I
called
saw that.
yeah, so called Juicy and Delicious, which is a very different title.
Yeah,
Very
right.
different title from Beasts of the Southern Wild. Um, and yeah, so this the young gal who, she's an adult now, but she auditioned when she was 5 years old or something.
Quavenjane Wallace.
Avenging, yes, thank you. At age 9, she was the youngest Best Actress nominee in history.
That is the best acting from a child I have ever seen. And I say that as someone who was on Broadway as a child, who spent my whole life looking at all of this. Just amazing.
A lot of her dialogue is voiceover, but she does so much with a look. Man, that the scene with her father towards the end, when they're looking at each other and they're both like, saying "Don't cry, don't cry," and oh,
Yes.
just amazing. Yeah, so she definitely deserved that nomination. And the gentleman who played her father apparently wasn't an actor. This was the first thing he ever did. He ran a bakery across the street from the casting agency, and just became friends with them. Um, and so yeah, all these people feel like real people, and you have people like I love, was it Peter T, who even in the midst of all this is still wearing a bowler hat and a sport coat. Um,
Yes.
and
Yes.
and this is my New Orleans. I got this hat in New Orleans, so I'm kind of like, wearing this in tribute to Peter T. Um,
But that's why I feel like it does have that social realism thing, right? Like all the actors were locals here in Louisiana, and that makes a huge difference. There's such authenticity and realism that they're all bringing to the camera and to this story and to the experience of what it is to be these people, because they either are these people or they know these people.
yeah, and there's something where because it's so surrounded by the natural world, whether that's the domesticated animals that they are raising for food or pets, or the actual beasts of the southern wild, or just like throwing that whole big tub of crawfish, just all the horrifying life skittering about, that there's something there that in a way is very, I hesitate to use the word pagan, but there's that sense. She says that everything that fits together in the universe, and if a piece is out of place, then things are wrong. And we see her from the very beginning picking up anything living and listening to the heartbeat, and we can hear the heartbeat on the soundtrack. And that goes for anything from a tree to a crab, to a chicken or a pig or her father. And then the teacher says we're all meat, right? So
Mhm.
there's very clearly that sense of balance and imbalance in the universe, and there's that speeches that um, refer to kind of cryptically to what's essentially climate change, and that the things are the images of the glaciers melting and all that, that things are out of whack, and that's what flooding ultimately is. And that Miss Bathsheba says something about how you know eventually things are just going to die here when we had to move, but nobody wants to leave. And that's the sort of thing you were talking about with just that resistance to anything that takes away from their way of life. And the notion that being rescued is terrible. Like
It's
they don't want
subjective. Yeah, definitely.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
they
I
want
love this point you made about the hearts, though. It's like I
to.
love this line that they have: strong animals know when your hearts are weak, that makes them strong, and then they start coming. Like, so this idea that you've got to monitor people's hearts, you've got to monitor people to like check in, right, on everything, but not just the humans. You've also got to check in on the animals. You've got to check in on the land and really see how it's responding, because if it is vulnerable, if it is weak and you're not protected, then these furious beasts of the southern wild are going to come for you.
Yeah, that they will feed on their own because that's what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so yeah, there's often that sort of thing about survival, and her father, Wink, the character's name is Wink, and they live in separate houses, separate shacks. He's constantly sort of pushing her to challenge herself physically, and he doesn't treat her like a little princess or anything like that. He calls her boss man, and
Yeah.
there's a very sort of masculine gender thing. Who the man? You the man, and kind of like show me your guns and like the kind of thing. So there's no coddling happening here, but it's very much like, I mean, there's deep love, but it's very much about, we're not going to sort of, feminize you. We're going to do whatever, get you to do whatever you need to do to survive. Beast it, when he wants her to tear apart the crap.
Yes.
Everybody's like, beast it, like as a verb, which is really interesting.
I love that scene. To me, it's almost feral, right? Like, because we're talking about beasts. So there's this sort of feral quality to them. But this is also, I mean, there's plenty of five-star restaurants here in New Orleans that will have a crab boil and there'll be paper on the table and you'll get a bib and all of these things, They charge you a fortune. I learned recently that lobster was also, slave food back in the day. And now look what they charge for it. Same thing, crayfish. They're going for insane amounts of money.
Yeah.
So there's this idea that there's people from the lower socioeconomic class that are surviving on these things that all of a sudden get turned upside down and commodified by the rich and taken away from them, the same way we're talking about all of this. And it's really, for me, Hush Puppy is such a great character because she sees the world in a different way, right? Like, I want to bring out this thing about, her mother is gone. We don't know what happened to her. We don't know if Wink stole Hush Puppy when she was a baby. We don't know if she's dead. We don't know anything really about what actually physically happened to her. Just she went off is what Hush Puppy is told. So she almost gets deified in a way because Hush Puppy is constantly calling on her. She starts out the film with her mother's clothes that she's, putting on top of her, or putting on top of Wink, so there's this way in which we've got the sacred energy or ashe of something that belonged to a dead person that now has the power of that dead person to help or to heal or to comfort or all of those things. And again, it's not overt that this is voodoo or magic or anything like that. And I think some people just think, oh, that's what you do. You keep dead people's things and you put them on when you miss them and stuff. But it really is magic when you break it down, right? There's a lot of hard science people that would say that that was crazy and not true. And, there's others of us that know that when we have those things for people that have passed, it does make us feel closer.
Things got a little strange where towards the end where they decide, the little girls decide, we're just going to swim out into the ocean, and finding that boat that takes them to essentially another version of the Lotus Eaters. It's like, it seems like everything we watch these days, there's always like sort of a Odyssean Lotus Eaters thing. I mean, I believe it's called. They even meant they. I don't know if it's mentioned in the film, but in reading about it, they call that area the Elysian Fields, and it's basically a floating bar and brothel, and these women are working there and living there, and she sees someone who she thinks maybe is her mother. Clearly isn't, but kind of is. She's being sort of lulled into this, and she's given fried breaded gator to take back to her. She's like, I gotta go home. That's very much a Louisiana story, right? It's a quest for the breaded gator that she takes back to her father, and it doesn't heal him, but it is a method of connection that is healing emotionally for the two of them. So what's the gator symbolism to you?
I mean, there's a lot. We look at, Zora Neale Hurston wrote about Uncle Monday, or this kind of folk hero in both Louisiana and Florida, which is very similar actually to a folk tale that they have in Benin about a crocodile, right? Like, so we've got a gator story here and they've got a crocodile story there. And it has to do with either the ability to transform into a gator or a crocodile when you're being pursued by people who are trying to enslave you or hurt you in any way or something like that. And then there's also this kind of folk hero that sort of grows up and teaches Black people, minorities, how to transform themselves into gators and set up new colonies in this liminal space that is not land and not sea, right? Like what we have in the swamp. It's just sort of spongy in betweeny land. So that's where we're at. But I do want to say two things about the brothel. The first thing is I love it that it's the first time that she really, other than when she's been born, that Hush Puppy really says, like, I'm getting carried, which is somebody who loved being carried as little. I love that kind of thing that, like, Hush Puppy always has to do it on her own. And in this moment, she's just sort of almost floating by the assistance of this, right, divine feminine. That's what I write about all the time, this sort of sacred feminine. Yes, it might be a sex worker, but it's also somebody who's showing Hush Puppy more actual comfort than she's received in a really long time. And the second thing I have to say about that is there's a music act on the floating brothel, and I'm watching it and I'm like, that's Big Chief Alfred Doucette. I saw him last week. So I messaged him and I said, Big Chief, are you in Beast of the Sutherland Wild? And he was like, yes, I am. And I was like, that's hysterical.
Yeah, because like they weren't there was a song on the soundtrack, but it wasn't what they were singing, so we didn't
No.
couldn't hear what they were actually singing. But yeah, I thought that was a neat touch that there's a cabaret act happening on this floating
With a
brothel.
real Mardi Gras Indian Big Chief,
Yeah,
who actually, anybody who's been around town, you see him all the time. Like most of them, you see him all the time. So it's part of community. So like, here we go again with the realism. Here's somebody that genuine New Orleans people really know as being somebody you'll go in. And my best friend just had an art show and he was singing at that. It's like, oh, you're going to go in there and you'll see the Big Chief singing at the art show, you know? That's just what happens. So I just love that scene. But I mean, all of them are so poignant and beautiful. But that was one that really touched me a lot.
yeah. There's this connection between the mother and the gator because we don't ever see the mother's face, but we see that she shot a gator that was coming up on Wink when he was sleeping in a lounge chair. It's like a part of that conception story. The story of her conception that is that she kills the gator and cuts it up and fries it up and it makes this magical meal. Of course, he doesn't mention the sex part, but she makes this magical meal that leads to Hush Puppy. So like, again, there's that kind of mythic, birth there. And so there's definitely that gator connection when she meets the woman on the barge that makes her think that, oh, this full circle thing and the gator is magic and all that. So there's a lot going on with just that little bit of symbolism.
Yeah, I love that line too about how he says she used to make the pots boil just from walking in the room. I think that's such a beautiful line. Again, not something you would think of as magic, but it is magic. Just the thought of it,
Yeah.
and I'm sure we've all met those people. Ooh, damn.
Yeah, I mean, the film shows that happening. That she didn't need to light the fire; fire automatically.
Nope.
Like that part. That part to me was very like Water for Chocolate in its magical realism
Yes.
sense. Yeah, that definitely.
Yes, yes.
Love that.
So beautiful.
So there's definitely something liminal about this their whole community, right? They're just like, oh, we're just gonna stay here during the storm, and even though the water's coming through the roof, and we're gonna put you in this cooler so that that's your tub, that's your boat, and so just go sleep now. you know
Yeah, and we'll
it's
get out the
so
roof when the water rises that far. I mean, I
yeah
know a lot of people like that. Every time we have a hurricane, there's people that stay. And I honestly have certainly wished I had a boat. And the times I did stay, I would have went through the roof if I had to. That was my friend's advice my friend Kane, who you stayed with when we were here ages and ages ago, who's no longer with us, Kane Maselli. She had to get out of her roof during Katrina. She's like, make sure you got an axe.
wow.
It's a reality, and anybody who lives here permanent, that's a reality for all of us. So that's why I was saying our apocalypse in a lot of ways has already arrived because we deal with these things, boil water advisories, toxic dirt, like we deal with these things all the time, because we are more in an extreme, literal liminal kind of thing, right? We're at the base of the Mississippi. We're on the Gulf, kind of, if you go not that far. So we are literally in this in-between space. And we're underwater. Like New Orleans is a city that's literally below sea level. So it's just It defies logic. And so much of stuff in Louisiana does defy logic. That's what I love about this story, because for Hush Puppy, these beasts that come to her are, like you said, both good and bad, but familiar in a way that I think people don't understand. And it's just her way of structuring the world and understanding impending danger and navigating these things that are so difficult in her life, right? She doesn't have a mom. Her dad's dying. Her home is lost. She's, losing everything all over the place. And she doesn't know what to do. And I think that's something we all identify with, whatever age, but certainly as kids we had those moments where, oh, look at this, wait a minute, the adults don't know everything, or the adults aren't going to be here forever, and it's a painful moment, but it's one we all have to come to.
Yeah, and they bow to her at the end.
Yes.
She
Yes.
they bow to her and then leave. I mean, so she has this power over them, and in the film they're called aurochs, and they're sort of like giant sort of boars slash bison slash mammoths. It's this whole thing. But yeah, that she ultimately has dominion over them in a way, um, in which she's like, well, leave us alone. We need to do what we need to do, and ultimately they have to put her father on the barge, as it were, light that barge on fire, and that sort of funeral chant that they do is
Yes.
super interesting. It's like
Yes.
she's coming. So it's feminizing of the natural world there, and they all knew it. It wasn't something that someone just kind of made up on the spot. It was something that they all knew to say, and I wonder what the source is for that, or if there's any kind of analog in Bayou culture.
I mean, it's interesting because we do have so many songs in town that, like, if you say this line, everybody else will respond. I remember when I was working for Dr. John, we were in the elevator with Bonnie Raitt and the Dirty Dozen Band, and Bonnie Raitt just busts out, "Hoonah, and then everybody else is like, "Hoonah," right? Like, so that's like, it's like a call and response that's sort of ingrained. It's been there our whole lives, right? Like, so we know what to say, and we know how to sing it, and we know the high notes and the harmony and what it does for both individuals and the community. And it's so beautiful. It's one of the reasons I love living here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that I fantasized about being a part of growing up. Like, you know, I, you guys, you walk out the door and there is a procession, there's a parade, and I just remember
Yes.
that when I was a kid and the bicentennial hit, and even in our tiny little street in the middle of nowhere, we did a little bicentennial parade, and it was like this, the notion that carnival was happening, like that it's so much a part of like your world that I always fantasized about, that just constantly being in that liminal space of celebration, and I craved those times. Which is why I loved Halloween so much, and it was like, because for us it was the only time the line between private and public space was blurred, and the porousness is pervasive. The water the
Yes.
water gets in, the doors aren't doors.
I keep thinking, I lived in New York before I moved to New Orleans, and it's like always sort of a shock for me because there's only 300,000 permanent residents in New Orleans, which means we're a small town, but we get 10 million tourists every year. So it's just this sort of weird balance where we're always outnumbered. There is no real boundaries during carnival time and during all these other, maybe 20, 30, 40 celebrations. Most of what we do is we'll go to somebody's house. We went to somebody's house the other week. I'm with my godson. He's like, whose house is this? I don't know. Who are you in the kitchen? Whose house is this? And not like we stormed it. We knew someone who maybe knew someone who was the roommate who wasn't there of the someone who was there, and it's party, eat king cake. So, but we don't care. It's just like you automatically become family. You automatically become part of this larger society and are welcomed, despite the differences. Like you said, there'll be people there from all socioeconomic and racial backgrounds. And, I honestly, in my over a dozen years of coming to Mardi Gras and Carnival, I've never seen anybody in somebody's house get into an argument or even raise their voice or anything. It's just despite the drinking and the partying and the rest of it, everybody's very friendly. It's very nice.
Yeah, and I noticed that, like, I think in a different kind of film, there would have been a lot more sort of danger from people for Hush Puppy. And Wink is basically like, oh, if something happens to me, then Walrus over here will be your daddy. And and you start to think that, like, oh well, there's something maybe gonna wrong with this, but no, it doesn't go there in this story, I'm kind of grateful for that, because it's like,
Me
you know
too. I thought the
it,
same thing. I was like, what? He's her daddy now? What? This could go all sorts of wrong. But it's just like,
yeah,
oh, okay. This is how we're moving
even
forward. Wink knows she's going to be taken care of. She
yeah,
knows she's at least going to be taken care of with the low bar standard she's already been taken care of.
yeah,
So,
yeah. And even when they get picked up by that boat, and the guy is kind of somewhat suspicious, and he's got his chicken biscuit wrappers, but no, he takes care of them as best he can too. So there is none of that, like, threat of danger from humans, and especially from men, that you would normally see in a film like this. And I think that's not what this is about, and I think that's great. I was looking at the filmmaker. So interestingly enough, this is he's a guy, he's part Jewish, from New York, from Queens, white guy. Yeah, Ben Zeitlin. Since then, he's only done one other film that came out in 2020, and that's it. He did
wow.
a film inspired by Peter Pan, and it was the film's called Wendy, but it takes place in Antigua. So it's
Oh,
you
okay.
know again, that kind of, like, it seems like maybe there is that mystical magical realism thing happening in a diverse area. So
I want to
it's
see that now, because I feel like Hush Puppy, you're saying Hush Puppy is this sort of gender fluid character, right? Show me your guns, all of this. But it also kind of reminds me of, the Wendy story, right? Like that, this kind of like the leader of these boys and acting both like as a mom, but also in like a traditionally masculine way. So I love that tension that we get in the Peter Pan Wendy story. All right, I think we've sort of said quite a bit about Beasts of the Southern Wild. If you haven't seen it, please find it. It's streaming in a couple of places still, and so you can seek it out. And I think that the magical realism and the power of the film definitely makes it a must watch. So thank you for listening to us. Thank you for liking and subscribing. Thank you for joining the Patreon, those of you who help us out, right? Like, we do this as a labor of love, but, we need money too. So thank you for helping us in whatever way. And as I said, even if that's just a like or a share or a comment or a thumbs up or whatever, we really appreciate it. And we will be back again. We are a bi-monthly show every 2 weeks. You can get another episode except when we go on vacation. So have a great day, night, evening, life.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.